Today, we are thrilled to have with us the Reverend Dr. David White. David is professor at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. He is the C. Ellis and Nancy Gribble Nelson Associate Professor of Christian Education. Professor White brings to us that great intersection of a lifetime of scholarship, but also, as he shared with me beforehand, every year since his beginning of education, on his path to this work, he has also been a minister to youth, an associate pastor for youth, or a coordinator of denominational work with youth in his various settings. So a lifetime of experience in actually ministering to youth, as well as research that has been fruitful for all of us who are in youth ministry. In 2005, David came out with his book, Practicing Discernment with Youth, which was a Lilly Endowment funded project. It was a terrific assistance in my own youth ministry. Since then, he has published Awakening Youth Discipleship in a Consumer Culture and Dream Care, A Practical Theology of Youth Spirit and Vocation. And what David's going to be sharing with us today is going to be sharing with us a conversation about that topic, about this question of a theology of youth, spirit, and vocation. A wonderful way to round out our week together. David, you have given us the gift of time by coming and joining us. Thank you for that gift. And all of you who've joined us here, thank you for the gift of your time this week so we can collaborate and develop the kind of networks and friendships that will enrich all our ministries. Professor White.
Thank you, Skip. That was not a rousing, you must have stayed up late watching the basketball game, is that right? Sort of like dropping one French fry in a vat of grease, right? But anyway, you a little sleepy this morning? I want to begin with just a little story, an anecdote. My friend Duffy Robbins tells. He says that during the Civil War, Grant had to chastise the Union troops because they kept attacking and conquering Richmond, Virginia. Why was that a problem for Grant? It was a city that was considered Confederate territory, but the problem was the Confederate Army wasn't there. And so Duffy makes the analogy, we in youth ministry, we have more resources than ever before in the history of the world. More curriculum, more conferences, more events, but we don't often step back and get a sense of our overall aims, what we're doing theologically, what we're doing historically. And so this morning I want to take a step back, and I want to begin just by saying once upon a time, there was no adolescence. Did you know that? Once upon a time, the word adolescent was not even coined until around 1903. G. Stanley Hall coined the term adolescent. But adolescence is what we've come to know adolescence as, this prolonged state of limbo that carries us from childhood into adulthood, has at times in history been very, very short, as little as a few weeks or months, but certainly not decades like we're seeing today. Especially as we'll talk in a bit, if you consider emerging adulthood, as some do, a prolonged adolescence, we're seeing this state of limbo being prolonged. I do want to just say a little bit about what youth were before they were adolescents. Before about the middle of the 19th century, up until around 1850, adolescents or young people worked alongside their families, alongside their parents on the family farm, playing significant roles in the life of the community. Sociologists identify a set of practices they call the traditions of youth. And this is not only in North America, but in most of certainly most of Europe and most of the world, actually. Youth played a particular role in village culture. And the traditions of youth, and I won't tell you all that I know about them, but several times a year, young people used to gather together and they would hold feasts. And you're familiar with May Day festivals, Midsummer's festivals, Guy Fawkes Night, Feast of Fools was sort of a Christmas festival. Several times a year, young people would gather together and feast and dance and celebrate. But at some point in those celebrations, the celebrations would evolve into forms of social protest or seeking social equilibrium. The young people would march together en masse to the home of a man who had been known to, for example, been beating his wife. And so they would mark a big X, a stigma on his door, and hang him in effigy in the tree outside and protest. And then later on, at the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, young people would march on behalf of lower bread prices and higher wages alongside their adults. So young people played significant roles in the politics, in the governance, in the social equilibrium of villages up until around the middle of the 19th century. And what we see happening, of course, is young people moving en masse from villages where they worked alongside their elders to the urban centers. Now, this didn't happen in the United States on a wholesale level up until the 1930s, and we'll say more about that in a minute. But as they moved into the urban centers, they looked for factory work. And as they looked for factory work, they ended up displacing a lot of adults in factory work. And sooner or later, the adult unions, pushed youth out of those jobs. And we see young people roaming the city streets. Are you familiar with, of course, any Dickens novel? You see that there are lots of street urchins who were forced out, who came from rural areas and who were forced out of low-skilled jobs and are roaming the city streets looking for something to do. For the Methodist tradition, the Sunday school movement was started in this context, trying to find something to do, and the common school movement emerged in this context, trying to figure out what do we do with all of these young people who have been displaced. In the United States, up until 1930, most young people still worked on the family farm. But what happened in 1930, in the 1930s? The Great Depression. And how did that affect young people, adolescents? Well, they certainly couldn't work any longer side by side with their elders on the family farm. They were displaced along with everybody else. And so many of them roamed the countryside looking for work. And eventually, around the middle of the 30s, the government established the works projects. Some of those included youth camps, trying to train young people in middle-class norms, behaviors, and some sets of skills so that if jobs ever did open up, they would have jobs. Eventually, those youth camps began channeling young people into what? High schools. In 1930 in the United States, only 20% of all American teenagers went to high school. 20%. In one decade, by 1940, that figure had risen up to over 85%. So in one decade, we see young people who are now no longer working, playing important social roles in the villages, but are now sitting in classrooms and subject to all sorts of educational strategies. But another thing I'll just name, and I usually kind of spread these lectures out over a semester, and I'm trying to give this to you real fast. But another thing that happened that's really significant for the life of adolescence, creating the shape of adolescence as we know it today. In the 1930s, up until the 1930s, marketers had an unwritten agreement that they would not market to children or adolescents. They would not try to sell things. They would not create ad programs designed to market to children and youth. But once they saw high schools emerging, they said, we have a captive audience. And so they began, in various sort of innocuous ways, placing little ads for letter jackets and popular music, in class rings, those sorts of things, in scholastic journals. Parents were outraged. Parents, now remember this, just a few years before, young people had been a source of income, and now they were a drain on the family income. And so parents were outraged that their young people were now being exploited by marketers. And this kind of grew, this marketing effort sort of grew and burgeoned to include fashion and popular culture and all sorts of things. But in the 1930s, there's this debate going on in magazines and journals between marketers and parents. And here's the argument that the marketers finally made. They finally said, look, high school dropout rate is really high in high school because young people just a few years before, had freedom. And so sitting in classrooms until you're 18 was, problematic for lots of teenagers, and so there was a high dropout rate. The marketers said, look, if we can create a youth subculture where youth have their own fashion, their own music, that can be like the glue that holds them together and makes them stay in school. And so parents finally consented to that, and that becomes the unwritten agreement, the bargain that's struck between families and marketers and youth that as I said, has only burgeoned since the 1930s. Well, we could say a whole lot more about the development of adolescence, but those were some of the key components of the development of adolescence. We know, of course, that developmental theorists began to notice adolescence. As I said, there was no adolescence until 1904. G. Stanley Hall wrote a couple of big volumes, books on adolescence, trying to help people understand who these people are. And his theory, I wasn't going to tell you all of this, but it's really interesting. He had this theory that life, and this was common to psychologists in this era, and we see it in Freud, that in life we only have so much energy, finite amount of energy. And if we use it all up in adolescence or youth, then we won't have enough when we get to be adults. And so his theory was, he used this metaphor of a mountain stream. He said, life is like this mountain stream where the glaciers are melting and they form big rivers. But when they get down to the bottom of the mountain, they branch off and form little streams and rivulets until they finally reach the ocean and they're just a trickle. And he said, in order for people, modern people, to have energy on later into life, we need to build dams to hold this energy of adolescence so it's not dissipated too early. And of course, we know those dams, they became the high school movement, they became the court system, the YMCA, scouting movement were all born and became popular during these times. So they were all trying to find some kind of holding environment for young people so they wouldn't dissipate their, as G. Stanley Hall says, their golden energies. On one hand, he was giving youth a compliment, and I still think this part of what he had to say is true. He said that adolescence is a golden stage of life. He says life glistens and crepitates. That's his terminology. Glistens, and so he says it's this time when people are more alive, more romantic, more in connection with the earth, more in camaraderie with other people. And so there's this romantic stage of life. I still think that's probably true. Well, I think on some level, I think young people or adolescence is when they're awakened to the possibilities of flourishing in life, when they connect with the earth and friends and those sorts of things. Most people who go on to become scientists or even great politicians point to some time in their adolescence when they were awakened. And so I still think part of that theory has merit. But what happens when you build a dam? What else? I mean, he has this theory that you build this dam to prevent life from dissipating and draining off. But when you build a dam, right, it becomes static. It becomes, maybe polluted even. But more than anything, what happens is you're removing adolescents. You're taking them out of the friction of the world, where they learn about life, where they become connected to life, where they test their energies, they test their spirit in relation to their creativity, and in relation to, as we said a moment ago, social equilibrium, the social good. So we see the adolescents being placed into this holding environment where the norm is no longer that they will partake in the traditions of youth maintaining social equilibrium. Although we see some of this in adolescence all through the modern era. Youth have been a part of every social movement in modern history. They were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, every peace movement in modern era. So we can say that youth probably do have that capacity, but we have not provided for them. The holding environments we have provided for them have not been adequate in helping them find their own powers. So anyway, and I use the term in one of my books, the domestication of youth. And this state, this limbo state between childhood and adulthood, as I alluded to a moment ago, has now been extended into emerging adulthood. And so we're seeing young people not being expected to play any significant social role or take any serious responsibility for their own life or the common good until later and later in life. And my last point up here is simply that churches have often been complicitous in domesticating youth. And a lot of our programming, and this is why I say ambiguous, because I think there are lots of churches that really that really do get it and that really do empower youth in lots of important ways. But for too many of our churches, adolescence and ministry with adolescents has involved a sort of fun and games approach, or a protective, which is all sort of well-intended, but a protection and as I said, kind of a domestication in pizza parties and lock-ins. That's the beginning and end of what counts as youth ministry for lots of churches. So I wanted us to have this historical context. So what we're talking about today is an adolescence that's been extended for longer than any other age cohort in the history of the world. So as we're doing youth ministry, this is the context in which we're trying to do youth ministry. Does this make sense to you? Any questions?
Your point or your argument that adolescence is prolonged makes a lot of sense to me, but we also see a lot of youth that are exposed to increased violence and are in situations that adolescence, as we've conceived of it, is kind of robbed of them. And what does this mean, this increase in violence and this almost like thrusting of a very violent and adult world upon youth?
Well, I'm not in favor of that, and I think the question is, how do we shape youth to participate in the common good, where they're playing an important role? But I'm not saying that protecting youth doesn't there's not some role there for the church and the community and the family for protecting youth. But I sort of think of a holding environment, right, as an environment that includes two things. It includes comfort and challenge, both of those things. So it's important for us to provide a limited kind of protection where we protect youth, but we also allow them to engage in challenges that help them cultivate their own gifts and their own sensibilities and their own sense of purpose. So does that make sense? I mean, I haven't addressed the question of youth violence. I think the question of children in violence and youth in violence is enormous. And what I do doesn't really touch that. That's a larger question. It's a social, cultural question. What we can do in congregations is think carefully about how we're doing both of those things, how we're comforting, protecting, and challenging. Holding environments have to do both of those things.
Do you think that compartmentalizing the raising of our youth has really thwarted and hindered parenting? Because so much of the authority and the influence is at a distance from the
Yes.
home. And it kind of feeds on itself. I don't know what I don't know, therefore I'll farm my kid out to these other people who I hope and pray do know better than me, because I was sent to high school. So, like the generations, as the generations progress, there's less ownership of the parenting or the
Yes.
raising of the people.
Yes, absolutely. I think for lots of reasons, I think compartmentalizing youth in age cohort groups and the reduced number of adult guarantors that relate to age cohorts of youth is a problem for lots of reasons. One, just thinking historically, as we've already begun to do, youth don't see what adult work is like. They don't begin to model. They don't begin to try to test their own capacities and abilities by trying what they see their elders do. And they don't get the wisdom of their elders and all sorts of things. In a moment, I'm going to point to the key role for adults in helping young people discern a sense of purpose. That really is, I think, a crying, critical need for adolescents and young adults in this world. Okay, but so I do want to move ahead, and I'm going to move ahead by talking about the research of William Damon. Does anybody know William Damon? He's the director of the Center for Adolescent Studies at Stanford, and Peter Benson, who up until I think he died just a few months ago, was the president of the Search Institute. And I'm also going to refer to the work of Christian Smith, the National Study of Youth and Religion. Up until early 2000, when we talked about the ages and stages of life, we thought about Piaget, Kohlberg, Erikson, and adolescence was a discrete stage, and then adulthood. And Fowler, had a stage for early adulthood, but we didn't call it anything different. It was, stage 4, stage 5. So along comes Jeffrey Arnett in the early 2000s, and he argues that we need a new stage. Just like we invented adolescence in the early part of the 20th century, we now need to create a new stage of life, which he calls emerging adulthood. And he's arguing that we need to carve out this time, and he's not clear himself about the upper end of that age bracket. Sometimes he says up to 22, 25, even longer than that. But he's saying that we need to carve out a time where we have no expectations that adults would play significant or serious social roles, or that they will have begun to take responsibility for their own work and care for their families and those sorts of things that adults have, that is typically sort of marked off adulthood. when the sociological marker for adulthood is someone who is able to work and sustain their own life and their family's lives. Arnett is arguing that we need to prolong basically this period of limbo. There are other theorists who have challenged him, and a couple of folks, I won't go into a lot of detail, Coate and Allahar, James Allahar, and Anton Allahar and James Coate, the University of Toronto, are two of these figures, and they argue that no, what you're arguing for is a prolonged adolescence, where youth continue to live in institutions where they have less than full power for longer than any other age cohort in the history of the world. So he said that's what you're basically arguing for. And so they resist that. And so even now there is this debate, human developmental theorists debate the legitimacy of emerging adulthood. But what's the problem with that? What's wrong with prolonging this stage where we don't really expect them to have serious and significant social roles? Well, William Damon says that one of the problems is that today's young adults seem stuck in a state of, as he says, aimless drift. Aimless drift, lacking commitment and direction for their lives, especially for pursuits larger than themselves and their network of friends. He says, regrettably today, young people increasingly find it difficult to establish commitments that signify a sense of purpose in the world. A survey of American college students from 2000-2006 shows that only 1 in 5 American young people aged 12 to 22 can express a clear vision of where they want to go in their life and what they want to accomplish and why. And almost a quarter of them express no aspirations at all and see no point in acquiring any. So this is new. This is something new. In 1970, entering college freshmen, 70% of them could talk about their hopes of a vocation that served the common good. And only less than 30% lacked any sense of purpose. That statistic has flipped now. So, contemporary adolescence and young adulthood constitutes a state of purposeless limbo extending longer than any age cohort. Despite its theoretical reification in Jeffrey Arnett's vision of emerging adulthood, this prolonged limbo does not appear to be benign. It does not appear to be benign. William Damon says, and here's a quote by Damon. You probably can't see this, but I'll read it for you. He says, this delay in development, is characterized more by indecision than motivation or reflection, more by confusion than by the pursuit of clear goals, more by ambivalence than determination. Directionless drift is not, contra Arnett, a constructive moratorium in either a developmental or a societal sense. Do you know what a moratorium is? Erik Erikson, adolescent theorist of mid-20th century, he said that adolescence is a time of moratorium, where we ought to bracket life and where they ought to be testing their powers and their abilities in the world until they finally settle on an identity that is stable. And so Damon is arguing that this prolonged emerging adulthood is not a constructive moratorium in either a developmental or a societal sense. Without a sense of direction, opportunities are lost and doubt and self-absorption can set in. An excessive delay beyond the period of readiness creates the serious risk that young person may give up altogether on the task of finding a positive direction and acquiring the skills needed to achieve the directional goals. So he's arguing that that there is a time of readiness, and that if youth if they don't find a sense of purpose or identity within that window of readiness, then they become paralyzed and established in their directionlessness. So that's his argument. He's also saying that, that there are other problems related to this sense of, this lack of direction. He's saying that while a sense of purpose can enhance the well-being of young people, a loss of purpose can cause a host of emotional and psychological problems, such as psychological fragility, self-absorption, depression, or lethargy, and as we'll see in a moment, other kinds of moral ethical problems. So he's arguing that having a sense of purpose is a matter of health, and not having a sense of purpose. One of the things I remember, he cites a study where young people who don't have a sense of purpose for their lives take longer and longer in order to recover from some trauma. And so there is a loss of resilience for young people who lack a sense of purpose. They become more self-absorbed. They lose a sense of empathy and compassion and a sense of the common good. And they're subject to depression and lethargy. Also, just a few years ago, Christian Smith, in a follow-up volume to his study, National Study of Youth and Religion, he was studying the young people who participated in that early study in their adolescence. He's studying them now as young adults. And he wrote a book called Lost in Transition, The Dark Side of Emerging Adulthood. And here's what he found. He discovered that there are, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but he's saying that young adults who don't find a sense of purpose, actually, I'm going to get to that later. He's saying that this is what he's seeing in young adults. These are the patterns. He's seeing a paralyzing sense of ambivalence about life. He's seeing an increase in drug usage and addiction. He's arguing that drug and alcohol abuse has become a lifestyle for young adults today, a normalized lifestyle. He's saying sexual promiscuity has been normalized, but the other thing he notes is that young people who now participate in these sorts of serial sexual encounters also say that they feel empty, that the sex is empty and meaningless, and a lot of them really suffer from depression because of the meaninglessness of their sexuality. Smith says, like he found in his early study, emerging adults are inarticulate regarding moral language. They basically don't have the resources to think about the morality of politics or the morality of the common good or the problematic sorts of ethical decisions that we face in a modern world. I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the only or the primary ethical, moral concept that young people have today?
Sexual orientation, I would bet, is the one that they are most passionate about, the acceptance of varied sexual
Yeah, I think that's a
orientation.
symptom of this concept, though. But that is true. Yes?
Inclusion.
Yes. It is a kind of banal tolerance. Live and let live. Laissez-faire, live and let live. I live my life, you live yours, different strokes for different folks. And they really don't have any kind of language for making critique or judgment on anybody and anything, unless the other person is being intolerant. Intolerance is the only moral concept that young people in this study could articulate. And then lastly, he says young people are generally apolitical. He's finding a real loss in a sense of the common good and how young people might participate in the common good. He says we were hopeful in the first Obama campaign that young people were getting involved and that we might be seeing an upswing here, but what we're finding is that was more or less an anomaly. We're all still hopeful about this, but generally speaking, young people in this age group have lost a sense of their responsibility for the common good. Okay, does that make sense so far? Yes.
There is something interesting about that, because I would also tend to think that adults have lost their willingness to support the common good as well.
Yeah.
And so if we are modeling, if we are anything but models for our youth, we're doing a pretty bad job, because we don't have to look too far beyond the headlines of the newspaper or our social media sites to see that we don't care either.
Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key findings of Christian Smith's first work in the National Study of Youth and Religion. Basically, if we think that we have not done a good job of educating our youth, in fact, they have learned exactly what we have taught them. And so we might even say this is the curriculum for liberal modern society.
I was just going to ask about it seems to me that you could view the common good as an institution. And I would say that young people are if not ambivalent, then actively repelled by institutions at this point. And so it may be that either we tend to think about the common good differently, or they're looking for ways to do more locally relational, immediate common good than the way we tend to think about it.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping. We're hoping that we're not seeing actually a rejection of the sense of responsibility for the common good, but maybe some alternate ways of engaging. That's what we're hoping. I think it may be too early to pass a judgment about that, but especially with the Occupy movement, we're seeing something different that may be too early to name. But I want to say, William Damon, as he looks at this data and the data from his own research, he argues that there's one factor that determines all of the others. And he says it is purpose. If young people have a sense of purpose, they have the tools to think morally and ethically. If young people have a sense of purpose, they have some sense of how they relate to the common good. And so he's arguing that when young people lose purpose, or when we as a community don't do an adequate job of helping notice, name, and nurture the purpose of young people, when we fail in that regard, then that's significant, that's serious, because young people in this world need a sense of purpose for these reasons. Sharon Parks, in her book, I don't know if you've read Big Dreams, Worthy Questions, Big Questions, Worthy Dreams, but she argues that young people are in this crux, in this transition from the modern world into the postmodern world of complexity, this globalized, new globalized context, global context. And she's arguing that not only do young people need purpose, but the world needs young people to have purpose. And so there's a larger sense. There's something else at stake. We're not just talking about the health of young people. We're talking about the health of the world. And I'll just note here, I wonder how you would say the church, what role the church has played in cultivating purpose in young people. And we won't talk about it, but my sense is it's not been something that we've focused on in any deliberate way. And I want to suggest that, as I do in my book, I want to suggest that we think hard about how we shape youth ministries that cultivate purpose, that cultivate vocation in young people. That might even be the overriding agenda for youth ministry at this time and in this place. So I just want to say that as a suggestion for now. Peter Benson and William Damon not only tell us there's bad news, but they also tell us the good news. And here's the good news. The good news is that every young person, virtually every young person they interviewed, and here they're talking about from childhood on up through adolescence and young adulthood, every person they interviewed could name some spark, something that made them come alive, something that made life worth living, something that and here's the list, something that gives energy and joy, something that makes us alive and useful, that draws on our best potential, something that causes us to lose a sense of time as we're fully absorbed in the moment, something that originates from inside of us, that's not just imposed as an expectation from outside, something that may emerge as a skill or a gift or a talent or an interest, something that might be thought of, and a lot of young people in their interviews talked about their sparks as the gift or for their reason for being in the world. And sparks are not just episodic activities or amusements. They're abiding sort of impulses and commitments over time, and they're prime sources of meaning and for self-directed action and purpose. And finally, a spark is something that makes the world a better place, that makes the world more just, that makes the world more beautiful, but that participates, for example, for as Christians we might say, participates with the work of God in the world. But for young people, in childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, Damon and Benson discovered that all young people have these sparks. And it's incumbent upon us as the community, as elders, as mentors, to help find those sparks, to notice, name, and nurture. When I was at Emory University for a few years on the faculty, and James Fowler was a friend of mine. Everybody heard of Jim Fowler, Stages of Faith? I went to his house for a wedding shower one time, and he told a story. He had just been visiting a village and had just been visiting Southeast Asia, and he told a story. He said, I was visiting this village, and the myth, the story of that village, the myth was that every baby that's born is born for exactly the right time and purpose. And it's up to the community to watch and to discover the gift that baby, that child has to bring to that community. And so as that child, as an infant, everybody's watching. Oh, did you see that? Oh, he did that. Did you see what he said? And so they're watching, and they're naming, and they're helping call out. And what's the importance of naming a gift? Why is naming important? Not just for us as the community, but sometimes it takes the community noticing things that we don't notice in ourselves, calling it out, noticing it and calling it out, and supporting it. So young people all have these sparks. And so he told this story, and I thought it was not only a good myth for South Asian village, but I think it has a good ecclesiology there somewhere. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. You know, you're speaking to something that I've been sort of just kind of going around in my head, and the word validation has been constantly going around in my head, particularly when you're speaking of that that extended adulthood or adolescence, that period they're in, that holding and that holding pattern.
Yes.
And they should be looking for purpose. And how often do they discover that, which is a spark, and we, the adult community, extinguish it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if it's not
Yes.
something that we think, you know, I think of the facilitator we had yesterday who had this passion to dance. And imagine if someone had extinguished that spark.
Yes.
You know, she wouldn't have been before us yesterday. It was such a tremendous presentation. So I'm glad you're speaking to this, because I was been sitting here. Well, what's our part in this? When do we get to validate that?
Yeah. Damon says that there's some baby boomers in the room. I'm looking around, and you're bound to be, some of you are bound to be as old as I am, so I'm a baby boomer. I grew up in a time where young people, adolescents, were pushing against the establishment, right? Pushing against the adults and saying, we don't want your wisdom, your advice, your formation. We want to find our own way. So, those adults grow up to be parents, and we assume that children don't need or want our guidance, that something will click with them and they will, like we did, find their own way. It is not, we're finding that not to be true. And I'm missing a quote here, but basically what we're discovering is that finding a sense of purpose, a sense of vocation, is unavoidably personal and inextricably communal. We need a community around us to help support us and help us find our sense of purpose and help us find ways that we can join our life with the life of God, participating with the work of God in the world. And so, how do we do that? Well, Damon, as the rest of the presentation, there are two parts to this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Damon and Benson discovered. They have some practices they're suggesting for parents and communities. But I also, in my work at Emory University with young people, have also discovered some practices that I'm going to name. So we're going to give you a whole lot of very specific kinds of practices today. And I had thought that maybe my book would be here, so it's not. So you'll have to write some of this down as we move along. But they say, Damon and Benson say that parents can become spark champions. That when parents find, here's some practices. Knowing your own teenager. Know them well. Know their, watch them, notice their strengths, including their temperament, their learning styles, their preferred activities, their psychological makeup. Know your teenager. Secondly, discover and reveal your teen's sparks or your child's sparks. Help raise your child's awareness of his or her particular sparks so that they can be deliberately cultivated. As we said, naming something for them, calling it out and noticing, helping them notice it, you noticing it and helping them notice it, makes it real to them. So discover and reveal your teen's sparks and be the captain of your teen's spark team. So young people need adults around them to remind them of their uniqueness and their value for the world. Parents can mobilize others in the community as role models, listeners, advice givers, and fellow journeyers. And then finally, keep your teen's spark lit. Parents can create space in the home for teens to cultivate their sparks of purpose. This involves crafting a positive culture, including time, space, encouragement, stories around the dinner table of people who had similar sparks and their trajectory, mealtime reporting, planning, helping young people plan, not taking ownership away from them, but helping them make plans for cultivating their sparks. Damon tells lots of really great stories. Have any of you ever heard of Ryan Hreljic? He tells this great story about Ryan Hreljic, who was in the first grade, 6 years old, right? And his teacher is talking about, they're studying Africa. And his teacher, almost in passing, talks about how this particular area needs water. They don't have clean water for their crops or for their animals or for themselves, for hygiene. And so for some reason, just this passing gloss struck a chord in Ryan. 6 years old, struck a chord in Ryan. So Ryan, at 6 years old, decides he wants those people to have clean water. So Ryan, at 6 years old, spends the rest of the year doing odd jobs around the house and in his neighborhood. And at the end of the year, he finds he has collected $76, which is not, of course, enough to dig a well in Africa. But his parents see how committed Ryan is to this and how moved he is by this project. And so his parents gather around him experts, people who have expertise in fundraising, some who know something about wells, and some who know something about public speaking and networking. And so they all are working with Ryan now at 7 years of age. And long story short, Ryan graduated from high school a couple of years ago. By the time Ryan had graduated from high school, he had raised over $500,000 for digging wells in Africa. And he has his own online corporation, nonprofit, called Ryan's Wells. And you can look it up, Ryan's Wells. But Damon's point is, never forget the significance of a spark in a 6-year-old. I was, another quick story, and then we'll take a break. I was in I'm a cyclist. You can't tell, I've been on sabbatical, gained a little weight, but don't judge. But I ride in 4 or 5 century rides, 100-mile rides every year. And I got an invitation a couple of years ago to ride in a charity ride in Bastrop, which is about 40 miles outside of Austin, Texas. And so I show up 7 a.m., just a few minutes before the starting time. Cyclists all over the park waiting, in their colorful kits, waiting for the start of the race. And so I go up to the registration table, and this whole race, and I don't know if you've ever organized anything like this, but it's a big deal. You have to have, emergency, medical staff on board. You have to have people at water stops with nourishment and water. You have to, I had trophies and lots of registration, money, And so he's coordinating all of this is a 14-year-old young man named Anthony. And so Anthony has this bullhorn, and he's giving orders, and someone saying, Anthony, the volunteer didn't show up on water stop 10. Grandma, can you go out to water stop 10? So he recruits his grandmother to go out to water stop 10. And so I said, Anthony, this is amazing that you are organizing at 14 years old. He says, yeah. He says, a few months ago, I discovered that my mother has breast cancer. And so I wanted to do something. I had to do something. I felt powerless. And so this is my way of doing something. So there are lots of stories like this. And the point is that it's really, really important for us as a faith community to gather around young people and find their sparks, help nurture them, not only for their sake, but for the sake of the world and the kingdom of God.
This is great. There is a dark side to this. And I see this regularly, especially in upper middle class, highly educated families. My youngest son recently was at a school in New York where it was a choral school, and they just did music. And there were kids at school with him who had shown a spark, because the school starts when they're 8 years old, of musical interest in singing, and the parents took off on it. And within a couple years, the kids had moved on to somewhere else, but the parents had not. Mm-hmm. And so now they were forcing the kid to continue to do this activity that the kid really no longer had any interest in doing.
Yes.
So I think there's a real
Sure.
art here, that it's not quite so simple as saying, oh, you're good at this. Okay, now we're gonna bring in all the experts and get in all this stuff and get you going, without really staying with the continuing evolution of the child.
Yes, and you're reminding us, it's a very good point, that vocation or purpose is not externally driven. It has to be something that we allow the Spirit to work in and through the young people. Because, as we'll see in a moment, from some of my research at Emory, young people, their sense does change. They enter in one door, and they find that that door opens another door, and that door opens in a different direction. So vocation is not a linear path always. And so it's important for parents and adults to recognize when the path may be changing. And we'll talk about all this in a few minutes. Okay? Back in the early 90s, Craig Dykstra of the Lilly Endowment used to be on the faculty at Princeton, went to the Lilly Endowment in the Religion Division. And one of the things that he was concerned with was youth ministry, as we've been talking, had kind of settled into a model that was domesticating. And so he was concerned about youth and the depth of their faith and how to build approaches that engage them fully and deeply. And so Craig started a pilot program at Emory University, the Youth Theological Initiative. Have you heard of YTI, the Youth Theological Initiative? Well, in the late 90s and early parts of 2000, the model spread across the United States and in Canada, and ultimately there were over 50 of these projects located at theological schools and divinity schools. But the model was this, that 60 teenagers from all over the United States would come to Emory for 4 weeks every summer. And the staff of this program would be, some of them would be PhD students like myself, others would be MDiv students who could come and serve as counselors or small group leaders. But we engaged these young people in a rhythm of study. I mean, these are rising high school seniors, 16 years old, reading Barth and getting it and loving it and enjoying it, and reading Moltmann and all sorts of theology. And so they were studying, and then they were worshiping. Every evening the youth and adult leaders would lead us in worship, and then we would periodically get involved in urban mission projects, and all sorts of things. The hidden part of the curriculum that we knew would happen, but we didn't know it would be as powerful as it ended up being, was the conversations that the young people had among themselves every day and every night about what they were reading and studying. Well, this model came to be a very powerful model for forming young people. And so, as I said, for a while when I was in my doctoral work, I was on the staff, and then I went back in 2001 and became the director of research. And while I was there, over a period of 4 years, we interviewed over 70 young people who were identified as young people who had a robust sense of vocation, a robust sense of purpose, where their life was headed. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we discovered there, and we'll talk about how it overlaps some with the study of Benson and Damon. Here are just some of the pictures from YTI. Okay. As we were studying these young people, we found that there were 4 different profiles. Young people were driven in 4 different ways: by desire, by compassion, by joy, and responsibility. Now let me flesh this out a little bit. Some young people, their future, when we asked them to envision their future, what they envisioned was a life filled with goodies. The big house, the big car, the consumer dream. Happiness can be bought at the cash register. Sometimes they said fame and status was a part of the goodies, but desire, they were this well of desire. And so their whole educational life was focused towards desire, getting the goodies in life. Now this was, I want to say, in the minds of all of the young people in one way or another. This is the American dream, right? This is the commercial, consumerist dream. And so all young people had this embedded in their heads. Now, the thing is, the other young people in the other profiles, their other energies, compassion, joy, and responsibility, served in one way or another to erode the power of the consumer dream. And so we would meet young people, for example, who were driven by compassion. They also had this consumer dream, but when they went on a mission trip, or when they volunteered to work with Head Start, or when they worked at the homeless shelter in their neighborhood, or the bread line, they would find themselves broken. Their hearts were broken by compassion, and they would determine that they had to respond in some way. And so for these young people, their lives, their future, they envisioned their future as responding, organizing a life that responds to the brokenness in the world, the suffering of the world. And so that's the second profile, compassion. The third profile, joy. This profile has to do with young people who discovered some kind of signature gift, some spark, as it were. Maybe it was music, maybe it was athletics, maybe it was administration, leadership. We had one young man who discovered that he was good at organizing, events, cultural events in his community, and that's what he ended up doing. So joy, I say joy because when they expressed the feeling of engaging their signature gift, and that gift being recognized by the community, and that gift playing a significant role in their communities, they expressed joy. That was the emotion that was most commonly expressed, a sense of joy at finding something that made them alive and that made their communities better. Responsibility. Now, whereas compassion and joy are energies that are somewhat motivated by the heart, responsibility was more or less motivated by the head, by the intellect. These young people, some parent, some mentor, some camp counselor, some youth worker, somebody awakened them to the powers and the principalities, the systems and structures of the world. For some, this was environmental, ecological systems. Somebody told them about environmental degradation and the whole system of the environment and how they were a part of it, participated in it. For some, this had to do with economics. Some of them learned about economic political systems and structures. Other young people, this was about racist structures or gender structures. But these young people were awakened to the systems and powers that hold and circumscribe our lives. And these were concepts, and the question for these young people was, how do I live responsibly in light of these systems and powers? So these are the 4 different profiles that we found. And I would say, in one way or another, these are sparks, right? These are things that kind of awakened energies that compel, and I think Benson and Damon might call these sparks. We call them epiphanies of recruitment because there was something somewhere at some time that helped awaken young people to a sense of purpose and for their lives. And these energies served as coil springs for motivating their lives. Any questions about these 4 profiles? I'm moving really fast and giving you, in a real succinct form, what I developed over a semester. So, yes?
What is the process of recruitment when you're talking about this YTI? Because from what I'm hearing in my ears, it sounds like it's kind of a privileged group. And so what happens when, what happens to the other children who are not a part
Yeah.
of this privileged group?
Yeah. Well, it was, in the beginning, it was extremely privileged, and over the years, different screening and application models have been used to make a more diverse. Originally, it was the only criteria, the main criteria at the time was youth who were faithful, involved in church, but who were also academically successful. And of course, YTI had its own feeder groups, chaplains in private schools and all sorts of things. But through the years, they've opened it and widened it. It's become much more diverse. And in addition, as I said, many more of these types of programs have sprung up all over the United States. Anything else? The point I want to make that I was alluding to earlier is that these energies, these pathways, are almost never pure types, right? Think about your own life. Did you enter in through one of these doorways and then, or was it two or more that were combined for you? It's almost always a combination of energies that compel us forward in our vocation. And also, as we were saying earlier, it's often the case, and we expect it to be the case, that when a person enters in through one of these doors, they're going to find another door open. How many young people began volunteering for Head Start or going on mission trips out of a sense of compassion, but in that experience began asking questions about systems and structures, that cause poverty and injustice. And so these energies all lead into each other in one way or another. But here's the problem. And we're going to come back to this. I have something I want you to help me with at the end of our time together. But the problem is, how do we, as the church, provide for young people theological language, theological narratives through which to perceive the significance of these energies? We found in our research at YTI that young people who had a more robust sense of vocation had some kind of theological language or Bible verse or theological concept that helped them make sense of compassion or joy or responsibility or even desire. And so for them, faith was not something that was split off over here and life and vocation over here, but for these young people had begun integrating their life and their spark and their faith. Now, what happens if we don't integrate those two? What happens if the spark that young people feel is not brought into the narrative or the world of theology and faith? What happens? Lose purpose? Okay. Yes, the narrative provides a deep significance to what we do. A narrative structure, the gospel narrative that begins at creation and goes on to eternity, provides a deep significance for us. Our lives are now weighted with the weight of glory, participating with God in God's work. And so that's pretty heavy. I mean, that means our life matters. And so, if young people don't have that, purpose can be much less. What else happens if you split off?
If the thing that a young person is passionate about in their lives doesn't connect to their life of faith, then the life of faith becomes irrelevant
Yes.
to their everyday,
Yes.
The thing that they're passionate about in life. And
Yes.
so they're likely to pursue their passion, but not really give much consideration to their life of faith on levels of importance in there.
Yes. And we found this happening both ways. We found young people who discovered some spark but never built a bridge to their faith. And we found some of them embracing the spark and their faith kind of becoming irrelevant and vapid and split off. And we found others who embraced faith but never really found any way for that to animate a sense of purpose. And so for them, they were wandering and struggling over here while affirming a sense of faith over here. So it can go both ways. But ideally, faith is about all that we are. It's about our lives, putting our lives into service and participation with God. So that's why this is important. This is significant. And not only have we, as the church community, not done a good job of attending to the sparks of young people or the epiphanies of recruitment, we've not done a good job of providing language, theological language, for them to help them build those bridges. And I want to suggest, at least in part, that part of what youth ministry ought to be doing is providing theological language for bridging these four kinds of experiences, these four epiphanies. And we'll return to that in a few minutes. But I want to talk about some of the other findings from our study at YTI. We discovered that young people who had a sense of vocation, there were also a set of precepts or practices that they had become proficient at. And this is my language, but we discovered in our interviews that young people who had a robust sense of vocation had become good at being attentive, being intelligent, being reasonable, and being responsible. Being attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible. And so I want to step through and talk about these precepts or these practices one by one. The first, being attentive. And as Anthony DeMello suggests, love springs from awareness. It's only when we see others as they are that we can begin to really love. But not only must we seek to see others with clarity, we must examine ourselves, be attentive to ourselves without misconception. The task is not easy. The most painful act is the act of seeing, being attentive. But it's in that act of seeing that love is born. So the young people in this study, we found that they were attentive to others. They paid attention to others. They watched. They learned to ask questions. They learned to probe and notice and become aware of others. They became attentive to powers and principalities, to the structures we were talking about. They noticed when we would be in a group and when a young woman, for example, was not getting to say what she wanted to say because everyone else was talking over her. They noted structures that were causing injustice. And so they were becoming attentive to powers. And they were cultivating those habits of noticing those structures and powers. They had grown attentive to themselves. They had learned to notice how they respond in the face of injustice or suffering. They had noticed what gives them joy, what gives them life. They had noticed what gives them pause and what helps them in consolation and desolation, in Ignatian terms. And they noticed their own gifts. They had grown attentive to their gifts. They had noticed the kinds of things that they do well. And they had grown attentive also to God. These young people were always asking the question, how is this related to God? How is this related to my faith? And these were habits and practices. I want to suggest that very few of these young people were born with these practices, attention to others, powers, self, gifts, and God. Over time, these habits were formed in a family, in a community. Someone found ways to support young people in being attentive. So I just want to list this for now. We can come back. Did you want to ask a question?
You don't have to answer this now, but I'm hoping that at some point you will help us think about how to engage the adults in our congregations and in our contexts to be able
Yes.
to encourage them to instill these sorts of values. Oftentimes when we think about youth ministry or Sunday school, Christian education, we think of it as being something for 18 and under. And so how do I engage the adults in my congregation and say, here's how you can inspire these things?
Well, let me say this, and this should be evident to us all by now. Skip and I were talking about this at breakfast this morning. Youth ministry cannot any longer be ghettoized or segregated as a specialized ministry in the attic or the basement of the congregation. Youth ministry has to be something that is integrated into the life and the rhythms of the community. Youth ministry at its best has to involve the parents, has to involve the surrogate parents, has to involve the extended community of faith who have become adult guarantors for children in the community. So I just want to say it's really important for us to have these kinds of conversations with adults, not just parents, but especially parents, perhaps. I don't have any magic for you. I will say that one of the things that I suggest in my earlier book, Practicing Discernment with Youth, is that every congregation periodically go through a period of discernment, a practice of discernment, which involves, in some cases, I've done this with over 20 congregations now, where they invite a steering committee of adults and youth who, for a period of months and sometimes years, be attentive, study the life of adolescents in that community and their relationships with adults and what they find life-giving, what they find life-draining, where are the systems of injustice, where are the powers, where is God alive? And so it's important for congregations to cultivate their own structures for doing this, but over time what these steering committees did was study the life of adolescents in the community, think theologically and prayerfully about how God is calling them at this time, in this place, in this particular context, to structure and organize ministry in ways that are addressing the context. And so I would say that's one way to organize a set of practices, but I assume always that you are much more creative than I am, and that naming these is the first step to trying to create practices and ministries that can be attentive to these, cultivating these. Yes?
My response to that is one resource is called Vibrant Faith Ministries. They're very much grew out of the Search Institute, and they provide a lot of resources online to give to parents, families of all different ages and configurations, to help just prompt conversation that is faith-based. Some of it you can use wholesale, some of it you have to really adapt, but it's theologically sound, and it's a good resource.
Yeah, and I want to say a lot of this you will see overlaps some of the Search Institute's work on basic assets. So you might look there. I don't think they have discrete practices there, but they at least have a framework for assets. The second precept is be intelligent. Now, how do we engage young people in being intelligent? Well, first of all, acknowledge that it's a part of our faith to love God with not our hearts, our souls, but also our minds. So what kinds of experiences, one of the things that we've found in these YTI young people is that a lot of these young people were in context where they could make connections. Where one young woman talks about going to a summer camp where she learned organic farming. And so there in that context, she could see direct connection between what grows to the temperature of the soil, to the water, to the fertilizer, to the care and maintenance, to the weeding, and all of these things are a complex part of the whole of organic gardening. So for her, becoming intelligent meant making those connections and learning those connections. Same is true for young people who were attentive to racism or gender bias or political or economic injustice. They also began making connections because they were in context where they were encouraged to make those connections and where they had, I'm going to name another one, a community of discourse and eloquent advocates. One of the things we found, eloquent advocates, these young people had people around them who were intelligent. They had people around them who helped open their eyes to environmental degradation, who helped open their eyes to racism, who helped open their eyes to economic and political systems and structures. And so these young people all had in their lives someone who could speak eloquently about injustice or systems and powers and structures so that they could make those connections too. And then, as I said, a community of discourse. Young people need people around them who can hear them, where they can express what they see and help them make connections, and who can themselves, hearing other people make connections. One of the values, as I said, of YTI was these informal discussion groups that went on all hours of the night in the dormitories of YTI, where young people got together and they would talk about what they saw and what they were learning and making connections between theology and injustice. And having a community of discourse, a place where young people can have these conversations is very important. And let me say this quickly. One of the things we discovered at YTI was that a lot of intelligent young people no longer go to church youth groups. We call them, they're refugees from church youth groups because church youth groups have come to cater to the least common denominator and no longer engage them in serious or and not this is a generalization, but I say that as a warning because intelligent kids, they're the ones who are yearning for some way to make these connections. Skip, I think we have a couple of hands here.
And wouldn't we all love to have all those intelligent kids in our youth group? But the fact of the matter is that we've got this one over here who's ADHD and this one who's got Asperger's syndrome, and the intelligent kids are the easy ones. But you've got all these other that you have to pay attention to as well.
Yes.
So it's no wonder, we lose the intelligent ones, but who all do we have to minister to all?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's frustrating.
It is.
No, absolutely, it doesn't. But it does create behavioral problems sometimes. I'm sure you would agree there.
I think you're kind of talking about the orchids, and as much as I love orchids, my kids come from every part of the garden. I've got dandelions, I've got kids that never bloom, I've got, every bit of the spectrum. And I blessedly have some of these amazingly directed and supported and well-fed and perfectly lit kids.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not the majority. As you pointed out in the beginning, 1 in 5. I love them, but I need that 5 to help me and to help them live with the other 4 because they're the majority.
The other thing I want to say is that youth group is not the only place within the community of faith that young people can be challenged and grow intellectually and in all the ways that we're talking about, deeper and wider in their faith. So I think we need to be thinking more creatively about how to notice those kids who, who are struggling, who want more theology or want more intellectual challenge, and find ways of, maybe that means intergenerational Sunday school classes, Maybe that means special book groups where young people are invited to attend. I mean, as I said, you're more creative. I did youth ministry for about 30 years, and I had all the problems you're talking about. But at times, we found ways of addressing creatively some of these things. So you're more creative than I am, I'm assuming. Anybody else? But I'm just naming, for the time being, I don't have answers here. I'm just naming what we saw in the lives of teenagers who had a robust sense of vocation. So they found ways of being intelligent. Yes?
Just as also a quick comment, when you're talking about persons per se who may not be intelligent, who may be not the orchids, that my caution, I guess, is to say that I have worked with a lot of children who are developmentally disabled, and just because they don't have this level doesn't mean that they don't have that level, and they do want and are looking for the words and the capacity. So it's not dumbing it down, it's finding a way to express it in a way that they can grasp and understand as well. So it's not simply, teaching to that talented 10. It's, finding a way to open it up so that you're talking to everybody. And so I don't think that this is exclusive of the daisies and the dandelions. I just think that it might be more of a challenge to try to work it in.
One of the things that Yolanda Smith, I think, spoke to you yesterday. Yolanda and I worked together at Claremont, where we started a youth project that was not geared for the academically successful and open to kids who, and all across the spectrum of academic success. And one of the things that, I'm not going to recount the whole pedagogical approach, but we were using in that 4-week community an approach that involved them, first of all, naming what made them angry or sad or frustrated or alive or joyful, and finding some theme that moved them past apathy. And only then did we ask them to try to think critically about the context of that situation and theologically. But what we heard over and over again from young people who were not academically successful was, I didn't know that learning could be so much fun. Because they, by starting with something they were interested in and working communally, they had discovered something that had been dormant in them. Their intelligence had been enlivened by the community, by their faith, by their critical thinking, and how we guided them through the process. So I just want to say, I don't think it is inevitable that we have to separate out the academically successful from those who aren't. I think there are ways that we can do this communally. Because of time, I want to move, being reasonable. And this is the one that has to do with judgment. Once young people are attentive, once they are thinking carefully and critically and intelligently, we need them also to be able to make judgments about what is good and bad. And so what we discovered was young people who were good at making judgments were those who had experiences with difference. They were young people who had a range of experiences with people who were not exactly like them and in contexts that were not exactly like their own. So they could speak more, they had a sense of the range of what was good rather than only thinking that their way was good. We also had, as I said, these were young people involved in discussion groups where they could clarify the good. They had theological wonder. They were always asking the theological question. When they saw something or a situation, they were always asking, where is God? And I wonder what God wants me to do. And so the theological wonder was always a part of their making judgments about their place in the world and what God calls them to do. And they also made use of compelling role models. These were young people who had the luxury or the opportunity to work alongside adults who were clear about a sense of purpose and who were clear about what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong, what is just and unjust. And so they watched those models and gained a sense of good in those, alongside those models. So these are some of the practices that we saw in young people who had cultivated a sense of reasonableness. And finally, these were young people who were responsible. For them, faith was not just about knowing things, it was about responding, finding ways of putting themselves at work in the world in some very concrete way. One of the things that we saw, and this is, we couldn't figure out where to put it, so we put it in this category, but the young people in this who had a robust sense of purpose in their lives were oftentimes young people who felt safe, who felt like their ideas, their experiments, their moves were not going to be, were going to be honored. And so they trusted the environment that they were living in and working in. They had cultivated this basic sense of trust. So that, and sometimes it was cultivated by parents, sometimes it was extended family members or youth group or church members or the community that surrounded them. But they had grown habituated in a context where they were not immediately judged for trying something different or having an idea. And so they had cultivated this basic sense of trust. And then, as we've already talked about, they recognized their gifts and began experimenting with their gifts and putting them into service. Now, we saw that what is the value of doing something concrete in the world? It is, of course, what we're called to do. It is, of course, being obedient to God. But what else is it? What are the internal goods of our action in the world? Self-worth, yes. Once we try something, and if we succeed, we can get a sense of our worth, that we're valued in this world, in this context, doing this thing. What else? Yes? Sense of agency. Yeah, I have power. I'm an adolescent. I live in this cohort where I have less than full power, but there's something I can do to make a difference. Yes. The other things that I just want to mention quickly is that friction matters. When we try to remove young people from a world of friction, we're doing them a disservice. They need to test their boundaries. They need to test the world around them, and they need to test their own skills and gifts and capacities. And so when they try something and fail, they're learning something about the world. They're learning, the world is like this and not like that, like I thought. They're learning, I thought I was really good at that, but I'm better at this. And so that friction that comes with being responsible in practice in the world has its own internal value, has its own internal good. It's not just about being obedient. It's about the learning that happens in the midst of practice, in the midst of being responsible in the world. So anyway, these are some of the findings from our research with young people at YTI, those who had a robust sense of direction in their lives. Questions? What kind of questions does this raise for you?
as we've been going through this, I keep thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how if your basic needs aren't met, it's really hard to get, and I think this is perhaps some of what you were suggesting. I just ache for the kids whose, bottom line needs, who can't trust. You said under be responsible, you have to have a sense of trust. I was thinking, oh my gosh, you have to have a sense of trust that your home is safe.
Yes.
And that so-and-so might come back, and that your other parent won't lose their job, and that there'll be some food in the refrigerator. So I'm struggling with that, and how it makes me ache for kids. All kids need this robust sense of vocation, but how much other work has to be done. I'm not saying you have to put that on hold, but these other issues, man, they get in the way.
Yes.
And it depends on our setting in youth ministry, whether or not we're still working with kids on these lower basic needs, just to begin to open up their vision that they might have a call and a sense of vocation. So I'm just sort of struggling with that at this point.
Let me just say this, and this is not an adequate response, but theologians are struggling with the question of vocation. It's a theological doctrine that emerged in the Protestant Reformation that got lost for most of the modern era, and we're just now, theologians are trying to reclaim it. Some folks say vocation is a luxury. But here's what I say. Yes, only those who are safe and who've had an environment that has cultivated all these goods can actually, I'm not going to, there are exceptions, there are always exceptions, but these are the ones who are more likely to promote robust sense of vocation. But the others, those folks who struggle in all of these different ways, that provides for the rest of us a sense of responsibility. Part of our vocation is to try to find ways of making the world more just and more a place that supports and nourishes these people who need to be safe and who need to learn patterns of attentiveness and intelligence and reasonableness and responsibility. So we need to be, part of what we're called to is about creating a world that is, where goodness can flourish, where vocation can flourish for all people, for all people.
Actually, I think it's a little more complicated than that, as everything is. But I'm very struck both by the kids you're talking about. You know, we're in a parish that's less than a mile from Bridgeport, which is one of the poorest cities in the country, and do a lot of work there. And then in our parish, there are a lot of very privileged kids. And the thing I'm struck by with the kids in our parish is how narrowly tracked they are. If you look at the Gallup poll data we were talking about earlier in the week, you know, the number one concern of the kids is getting good grades. And so in fact, I don't see a lot of sense of vocation among these privileged kids, or the kids with all the resources we're talking about. I see a tremendous drive for them to go to the right college and probably to major in business, and that the implicit goal, the implicit vocation, is to accumulate as much money as you can. In other words, sort of to become their parents. And that is just as much a kind of enslavement and a paucity of vocation as you see among kids who are struggling with survival issues every day and don't have a chance to think beyond those.
It's more than that, and let me just say this quickly. It's a failure of courage. It's a failure of courage on behalf of the clergy leadership to name the responsibility of vocation that goes beyond wealth. That names our responsibility in the world. That names our responsibility to serve the least and the lost. So I think our churches have to be more than a chaplaincy for the middle class. Our churches have to be places where pastors stand and youth workers stand up with courage and say, God calls us. These are our children too. our churches have to be places where people take courageous stands. Now, I'm just naming, for the time being, I'm just naming the data from our study. You'll have to decide ways and practices for implementing this. But I do think that if the church is going to survive, and if the church is going to participate in God's work in the world, this notion of vocation has to be reclaimed. We have to find ways of engaging young people who can think beyond fame and wealth and desire for the goodies. We have to find ways of introducing them to the call of God upon their lives. Therefore, I want us in these last few minutes, we have a few minutes left, 10 minutes. I want us to do this. I want these two tables, for the time being, you're thinking about desire. And these two tables, you're thinking about compassion. And these two tables, you're thinking about joy. And then these two are thinking about responsibility. This is what I want you to do. We didn't have time to talk about this as much, but in my book, I'm convinced, and what we discovered, as I said earlier, is that young people who have a robust sense of vocation are young people who can think theologically about desire, compassion, joy, and responsibility. And I wonder if you don't have to change tables, you can stay where you are, but I want you to just think about what does the gospel have to say about desire or compassion or joy or responsibility? What theological concept or narrative, or even doctrine? So what I'm asking you to do is to mine the resources of your tradition and try to find, what is it that we could tell young people about these 4 different epiphanies that would help bridge their faith and their practice. So let's take about 10 minutes, and I'll let you talk among your table groups, and then we'll check in. What group would like to go first and tell us your theological reflections on your theme? Who'd like to go first? Yes. And what was your theme? Compassion.
So we were talking about the fact, I said in my confirmation class this year, we had this huge discussion about fairness and compassion. And that they were very wrapped up in the idea of fairness. And so the kind of compassion that Jesus showed, that we talk about God showing to them, was stupid and not fair. Mm-hmm. So this tension was very interesting in how we work through that.
Okay.
No resolution.
Is compassion a faithful thing?
Well, one of the observations was that young people experience such a heavy emphasis on fairness at school, which then has, if indeed compassion is connected with faith, then that's sort of a secularizing emphasis on fairness over and above compassion at school. And so then they tend to lean in that direction.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts about how to build a bridge between Christian tradition and compassion? Any examples where Jesus showed compassion? Okay.
One of the things I raised was that there was a small window or opening after Newtown. We live near there, and because of hashtag 26 should have been 28 acts of kindness. Kids were sort of heavily invited to participate in that. So even high school kids were making a point of going up and sitting with the kid that nobody sits with at lunch for a while. And we were talking about once they go on mission trips or have an opportunity to see somebody outside themselves, it's a little bit easier just to step into somebody else's shoes. But Maria was pointing out it seems an easier entry point to have compassion for the other or their dogs or global warming or whatever than the teenager who's wronged them somehow at school. or their family?
In my book, I create a little fictional conversation between a teenager and John Sobrino, liberation theologian, who argues that that we're not fully human until we experience compassion or mercy, and he uses the term taking the suffering people down from the cross, and that he, of course, draws the correlation that Moltmann and other theologians draws between the suffering of the world and the suffering of Christ on the cross. So anyway, there are lots of different ways using our theological heritage to build those bridges, but those are the kinds of conversations we need to have. What another theme? Yes.
Our theme was joy, and it made me think about 1 James, where it says, consider it pure joy when you face troubles and trials of various kinds. And in my life, like when I was growing up, I had a rough upbringing based on the decisions I was making, and someone who's here right now, Richard Williams, spoke into my life and showed me that, he painted a picture of me sitting at a table with people who were very important, and for me that just gave me joy knowing that I had a purpose and that what I was going through wasn't going to be in vain, and that it was going to develop me and bring me to a place of purpose that I couldn't see for myself. And so I found joy in that, and that's what it made me think about.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we said and we just try to figure out how to apply that to youth ministry. And I brought up the topic that someone else brought up in the other table, that it's really the basic needs that the youth are worried about. Right now, they're not really concerned about their purpose or their vocation. It's kind of hard to draw that out of them. And, you know, we discussed how in the process of them going through their trials and tribulations and seeing what their parents are going through, feeding them the word and encouraging them and telling them, you know, the joy of the Lord is your strength, and the trials that you're going through, count it all joy. And trying, in the midst of them dealing with that, trying to show them that you're dealing with this for a higher purpose. All of this is going to come together to work for your good. And in that, you know, having them realize that, you know, I can help other people who are in a similar situation that I'm in. And I can, you know, show them that God is their joy. And then, like we were talking about merging the business, because a lot of them in my youth group are like, well, you know, I'm having a problem. Like, one of them couldn't get a dress for prom because she just couldn't afford it. She's like, you know, one day I'm going to start a nonprofit to help little girls who can't, you know, afford to get a prom dress. And it's really cultivating in them this sense of purpose that, you know, whatever I am going through now, I can count on joy because God is, you know, working and setting me up for a better purpose. And, you know, just tying in the fact that they're dealing with these problems that become a distraction from really trying to figure out what their vocation is. So, yeah.
Okay. Another theme. And you all had responsibility, is that right? Okay.
Our theme was responsibility. Congratulations to all the Heat fans. When I think of responsibility, I think of a task at hand or something you're accountable for. And when I think about the youth or any of us in here, I think our main responsibility is the Great Commission. That's our task.
Well, we also talked about, again, responsibility. The things that came to my mind were, the scriptures that spoke about how we should treat one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. The least you do to these, you do unto me. So there's that responsibility that we can extend, that we got to esteem others higher than ourselves. So to bridge that responsibility to the faith thing, the Great Commission to start off with, and then to give them the understanding that we have responsibility to one another.
Anybody read Walter Wink? Walter Wink has this, it's one of the theses of his entire body of work, but the powers and principalities, right, are these structures of the world. Sometimes they're political structures, sometimes they're economic structures, but he talks about them as spiritual realities. and he draws on the scriptural language and even the metaphor, the language in the Revelation about the angels of the churches representing the spirit of the churches. And he's arguing that powers and principalities, these structures, are spiritual. And our way of engaging them is also spiritual, similarly spiritual, of attending to them, discerning them, deconstructing them, understanding them, praying around them, and reviving them, restoring them in his mantras. The powers are good, the powers have fallen, and the powers can be redeemed. So the structures of the world, even the fallen ones, racism, sexism, political injustice, economic injustice, are structures that can be redeemed. Anyone else? Desire. Did we hear anything from you guys? Okay.
Oh, just one more thing about the
Yeah.
responsibility. On our table was talking about how, there's a sense in which we can train people, practice responsibility growing up, and you're practicing, making your bed and doing your laundry, and not really thinking beyond, sort of my household and what does this mean for the church. And so we were, kind of contemplating all these different passages of where Christ is talking about that, the Micah 6:8. What's true religion? What do I really want from you but to do justly and to love mercy and walk humbly with your God? And then even just like examples of his life of, to follow me, you have to be willing to hate your father and mother. These sort of being willing to go far beyond yourself to see that as responsibility of who you are in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the young people at YTI used language like tikkun olam, which is a Jewish term for care of the earth, and as a way of thinking about our responsibility, the call of God to care for the earth. We worked on. Oh, well, we won't do that. We don't have to do this in order. What group would like to go first and tell us your theological reflections on your theme? Who'd like to go first? Yes. And what was your theme? Compassion.
So we were talking about the fact, I said in my confirmation class this year, we had this huge discussion about fairness and compassion, and that they were very wrapped up in the idea of fairness. And so the kind of compassion that Jesus showed, that we talk about God showing to them, was stupid and not fair.
Mm-hmm.
So this tension was very interesting in how we work through that.
Okay.
No resolution.
Is compassion a faithful thing?
Well, one of the observations was that young people experience such a heavy emphasis on fairness at school, which then has, if indeed compassion is connected with faith, then that's sort of a secularizing emphasis on fairness over and above compassion at school. And so then they tend to lean in that direction.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts about how to build a bridge between Christian tradition and compassion? Any examples where Jesus showed compassion? Okay.
One of the things I raised was that there was a small window or opening after Newtown. We live near there, and because of hashtag 26 should have been 28 acts of kindness, kids were sort of heavily invited to participate in that. So even high school kids were making a point of going up and sitting with the kid that nobody sits with at lunch for a while. And we were talking about once they go on mission trips or have an opportunity to see somebody outside themselves, it's a little bit easier just to step into somebody else's shoes. But Maria was pointing out it seems an easier entry point to have compassion for the other or their dogs or global warming or whatever than, you know, the teenager who's wronged them somehow at school. Yeah, or their family.
In my book, I create a little fictional conversation between a teenager and John Sobrino, liberation theologian, who argues that we're not fully human until we experience compassion or mercy, and he uses the term taking the suffering people down from the cross, and that he, of course, draws the correlation that Moltmann and other theologians draws between the suffering of the world and the suffering of Christ on the cross. So anyway, there are lots of different ways using our theological heritage to build those bridges, but those are the kinds of conversations we need to have. What another theme? Yes.
Our theme was joy, and it made me think about 1 James, where it says, consider it pure joy when you face troubles and trials of various kinds. And in my life, like when I was growing up, I had a rough upbringing based on the decisions I was making, and someone who's here right now, Richard Williams, spoke into my life and showed me that he painted a picture of me sitting at a table with people who were very important, and for me that just gave me joy knowing that I had a purpose and that what I was going through wasn't going to be in vain, and that it was going to develop me and bring me to a place of purpose that I couldn't see for myself. And so I found joy in that, and that's what it made me think about.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we said and we just try to figure out how to apply that to youth ministry. And I brought up the topic that someone else brought up in the other table, that it's really the basic needs that the youth are worried about. Right now, they're not really concerned about their purpose or their vocation. It's kind of hard to draw that out of them. And, you know, we discussed how in the process of them going through their trials and tribulations and seeing what their parents are going through, feeding them the word and encouraging them and telling them, you know, the joy of the Lord is your strength, and the trials that you're going through, count it all joy. And trying, in the midst of them dealing with that, trying to show them that you're dealing with this for a higher purpose. All of this is going to come together to work for your good. And in that, you know, having them realize that, you know, I can help other people who are in a similar situation that I'm in. And I can, you know, show them that God is their joy. And then, like we were talking about merging the business, because a lot of them in my youth group are like, well, you know, I'm having a problem. Like, one of them couldn't get a dress for prom because she just couldn't afford it. She's like, you know, one day I'm going to start a nonprofit to help little girls who can't, you know, afford to get a prom dress. And it's really cultivating in them this sense of purpose that, you know, whatever I am going through now, I can count on joy because God is, you know, working and setting me up for a better purpose. And, you know, just tying in the fact that they're dealing with these problems that become a distraction from really trying to figure out what their vocation is. So, yeah.
Okay. Another theme. And you all had responsibility, is that right? Okay.
Our theme was responsibility. Congratulations to all the Heat fans. When I think of responsibility, I think of a task at hand or something you're accountable for. And when I think about the youth or any of us in here, I think our main responsibility is the Great Commission. That's our task.
Well, we also talked about, again, responsibility. The things that came to my mind were, the scriptures that spoke about how we should treat one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. The least you do to these, you do unto me. So there's that responsibility that we can extend, that we got to esteem others higher than ourselves. So to bridge that responsibility to the faith thing, the Great Commission to start off with, and then to give them the understanding that we have responsibility to one another.
Anybody read Walter Wink? Walter Wink has this, it's one of the theses of his entire body of work, but the powers and principalities, right, are these structures of the world. Sometimes they're political structures, sometimes they're economic structures, But he talks about them as spiritual realities. And he draws on the scriptural language and even the metaphor, the language in the Revelation about the angels of the churches representing the spirit of the churches. And he's arguing that powers and principalities, these structures, are spiritual. And our way of engaging them is also spiritual, similarly spiritual, of attending to them, discerning them, deconstructing them, understanding them, praying around them, and reviving them, restoring them in his mantras. The powers are good, the powers have fallen, and the powers can be redeemed. So the structures of the world, even the fallen ones, racism, sexism, political injustice, economic injustice, are structures that can be redeemed. Anyone else? Desire. Did we hear anything from you guys? Okay.
Oh, just one more thing about the
Yeah.
responsibility. On our table was talking about how, there's a sense in which we can train people, practice responsibility growing up, and you're practicing, making your bed and doing your laundry, and not really thinking beyond, sort of my household and what does this mean for the church. And so we were, kind of contemplating all these different passages of where Christ is talking about that, the Micah 6:8. What's true religion? What do I really want from you but to do justly and to love mercy and walk humbly with your God? And then even just like examples of his life of, to follow me, you have to be willing to hate your father and mother. These sort of being willing to go far beyond yourself to see that as responsibility of who you are in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the young people at YTI used language like tikkun olam, which is a Jewish term for care of the earth, and as a way of thinking about our responsibility, the call of God to care for the earth, as one example. Yes.
One of the things that I was conscious of was that we have a responsibility to our children to encourage them to seek a vision for their lives. And there's the passage of scripture where it talks about where there is no vision, the people perish and cast off restraint. And I think it's incumbent upon us to remind our youth that a vision can be in their lives, and that if they pursue God first, he'll give them that vision, then all of these other building blocks flow out of that.
Okay, thank you. So what do we say to the young person whose life is sort of focused around the goodies? Wealth, success, fame, big house, big car, the goodies. What do we say to them? Okay.
We had the piece of desire, and basically what we came to is a lot of stuttering. And I think what we finally came to is that the desire is not in and of itself a bad thing. It is who directs that desire and where does the desire spring from. Once it has sprung, how is it nurtured and where is it guided to? And I think that's about as much and as far as we went.
Yes. No, I think that's, in my book I have a fictional conversation between a young person and Thomas Aquinas, whose whole system is built around desire and this notion that we may desire the goodies of life, but unless our lives are ordered by the highest thing that we're called to, the highest order of desire is the Christ, our lives before God. And only when our desire meets God can the rest of our desires fall into place. So anyway, I'm just trying to spark your imagination right now about ways to have conversations with young people about these themes. I'm arguing, in closing, that this is an important agenda, maybe the most important agenda for youth ministry. I wonder if this has sparked any of your imaginations about how to structure this agenda. What could we do in the local congregation to foster vocation? How do we support young people? What do we do? What are some ways of organizing ourselves? Yes.
We have one of the, we're in an Episcopal church, and we have, a curriculum that goes all the way from 3-year-olds all the way up to 12th grade. And one of the things that we did this year was we really kind of took apart the whole latter part of that, the 10, 11, 12th graders, and really rethought what that was about. And what we experimented with this year was really, especially in 11th grade, really making a focus on discernment about your life and a life of meaning. And the way we did that was to really focus the conversations in that with that group on that, give them some real tools and skills around life discernment. And then we had a series of panels in which parishioners who were adults who were really full of joy and compassion and, a good sense of how to live their faith, just came in and in very practical terms talked about their lives and the role that faith played in everything from their family to their workplace to their avocations and so forth. And it was very much a peer sort of sharing. In other words, we really said, you folks are young adults, and here are some other adults, and how can you as adults really begin to learn the tools and see some of the fruits of the sermon. And the kids liked that so much better than a youth-based, separate discernment process.
Yes.
We've thrown out our entire committee structure in our church, and we have invited everyone to put their name in a place that they felt encouraged community with oneness with God and community.
Including young people. Yes.
I was thinking that perhaps we need to start thinking of ourselves as churches not as a place that people come to, but that we are a force that goes out where the youth are, where their desires are. We go to the concerts, we have the opening stage at some concert and try to inspire them about the relationship that music can have with, God, to let them see God where their desires are. Find when they're at their ball games, that the church should not be this building that they've got to leave where they are and come to, but that we could take interpretations to them and let them be able to see God, where they are.
What you're hitting at, all of you who have spoken, and I'll just wrap this up. There are 3 things that I think are the bottom line, concrete, practical things that we can do to organize ourselves differently. One is intergenerational relationships. Young people need to have a number of different kinds of relationships with older people. Not just with parents, but with uncles, aunts, pastors, youth workers, all sorts of older people, including those who they can observe doing work in vocation and talking about it. The second thing is experiences, and this is what you were hinting at. We need to provide young people a range of experiences where they're testing themselves and trying their skills and capacities and learning from them. And then thirdly, we need to create communities of discussion where people can have deep conversations, theological and critical conversations, and where young people can participate in asking their questions and offering their insights. So those 3 are some very concrete kinds of things that it strikes me that we need to be doing in the life of our congregation. So that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you to Professor David White, and thank you for your commitment to youth ministry and now preparing youth ministers and the research that enriches youth ministry and scholarship. I know that while we were scribbling notes, we were going, sure wish we had the book, and we can each find it, I'm sure, on Amazon, et cetera, in our local bookstore. Dream Care, A Practical Theology of Youth Spirit and Vocation. Dream Care, A Practical Theology of Youth Spirit and Vocation. And I had a question. Are the YTI initiatives still going on?
Well, YTI is still going on, and a few of those 50 have survived. Not all of them, because it's very expensive. But YTI is still going on. Duke has one that's related to liturgy and faith in youth. Trying to think of some other key programs. Well, there's one in Toronto. But look on, if you go to the website on the Lilly Endowment Theological Programs for High School Youth, you can find a list of the programs that are still alive and surviving.
So first, I just want to thank David White for the travels up here from Austin, the preparation and the presentation. Thank you.